We're now on the bottom of Daf Tzadi Zayin Amud Aleph, and we're up to Ella, which you'll see on the bottom of the Amud. Let me just give a little introduction to what we're about to learn. Until this point, the Gemara gave us a number of different scenarios which seem to contradict the principle of Shmuel. And as a result, the Gemara comes to the conclusion that Shmuel was only addressing the case of Chatas Avuda, and that he holds like Rebbe that a Chatas Avuda Mesa. And therefore, in such a case, in Karban Pesach, the din would be Karev Shlomit. But now the Gemara is going to explain what exactly was the case of the Seifa, the second klal of Shmuel, where he said, Kol Shabachatas Roa B'Pesach Roa. So again, the first klal of Mesa was referring to Chatas Avuda, and we're going according to Rebbe, and Chatas Avuda is Mesa in all circumstances. And on that, Shmuel said that it's in Pesach, in a parallel case of Avuda, it's Karev Shlom. But now we get to the second klal of Shmuel. Kol Shabachatas Roa B'Pesach Roa. Ella, the Gemara now asks the following question. If Shmuel was talking about Avudim, and he was telling me that in a case of Chatas Avuda Roa Le Rebbe, because we're holding now that Shmuel agrees to Rebbe, I mean, Rebbe was the one who said that in the case of Avuda and Chatas, it's Mesa. Where did Shmuel come off in his second klal, speaking about a case where a Chatas Avuda is Roa? We don't know that. According to Rebbe, there is no such case of Chatas Avuda Roa. It's always going to be Mesa. So what did Shmuel mean when he said that in a Chatas Roa, in Pesach, it's also Roa? If it's Avuda, and on the day that it got lost, he was mafresh a second carbon to replace the first, Rebbe holds that if there was no Kapar Sabaylim yet, then it's Dino Lemisa. And in a case of Avda Balayla, that's not considered Avud at all. So here we're going to look at Rabbi Oshia on the top of Daf Tzadi Zayin Amud Beis. The Gemara explains that even according to Rebbe, we found a case of a Chatos, which is Roa. And that's based on Kidder Rabbi Oshia. The Rabbi Oshia. Now here we have a case of what I call a security case. That it was quite common that an animal that was designated for a carbon might jump away and get lost. So what did he do to protect himself? An insurance policy. Hifrish Techatos Lachrayus. Achrayus means that in event that one of these two gets lost, he'll bring the second one. So he declares one of these two animals, which should be a chatos, and the other one should be a replacement for a chatos if need be. So in that case, Rabbi Oshia says the following: in other words, here's a case of a chatos she'avda, and it's l're'iyah. And in a parallel case, in Pesach, Shmuel is going to say l're'iyah. So the Gemara immediately asks, "V'ha'ilu bePesach yihai gavna karev shlomit." This is not a case of roa in Pesach. This is a classic case of Mosar Pesach. The din of Mosar Pesach is karev shlomit. So even if he brought the first Pesach, the second one is not considered dachui, which is dino l're'iyah, because initially from the get-go he was mafresh both of them al das, that one of them should be carved as a Pesach and the other as shlomit. So when he's mafresh two karbanos for achrayus, if it would be in chatas, it would be roa, as we saw in Rabbi Oshia. But if it would be a parallel case in Pesach, it would be carved shlomit. So once again, in what case was Shmuel's second klal that kol shebechatas roa for Pesach roa apply? So because of this kasha, the Gemara now is going to change its mind and reverse itself on the original explanation of Shmuel. And which Tana did Shmuel accept? Ella, says the Gemara, don't ask me your question about when, in what scenario do we have a chatas, which is roeh. Shmuel Rabbi Shimon Svirale, the Omar Chamesh Chatos Mesos, that there are 5 categories of chatos where the psul is so radical and so extreme that they let the animal die, and that applies. That halacha of mesos applies in all cases of the 5, which means that a chatas shekipru ba'aleh, if the bailam already achieved the kapara, is then mesa. The other carbon is mesa ve'eno roeh, and it doesn't matter one bit, according to Rabbi Shimon, whether it was lost and found after he brought the second carbon, or when they lost and he found it before he brought in the second carbon. It matters not whether he was mafresh it lachrayus, as we discussed before, Rabbi Oshia. It's always mesa. And if that be the case, if Shmuel can be identified with Rabbi Shimon, then it means whenever it's a chatos mesa, like for example, the case where he brought a second chatos to be mechaper, then Shmuel will say in a parallel case of Korban Pesach, it's Karev Shlomit. So this seems like a very logical and appropriate way of interpreting Shmuel. But the Gemara doesn't like it. Why? If Shmuel holds like Rabbi Shimon, Varoel Rabbi Shimon less like Klal. Shmuel doesn't have a case of Roeh in a case of Chatos, and Shmuel said that in any case of Chatos Roeh, in Pesach it's also Roeh. So the Gemara once again makes a little bit of a change, an improvement on our understanding of Shmuel. Shmuel Nami Chada Ka'amar. Shmuel only said one thing. What? Kol shevachatos mesa v'pesach karv shlamim. That second klal of roeh and roeh, which we attributed to Shmuel, lo hayv lo nifrit. Shmuel never said that klal. He holds like Shmuel. And in the case of chatos, there's no possibility of roeh. So it comes out that according to this answer, which the Gemara understands that from the get-go, we knew that Shmuel holds that in all cases of chatos, avud, and mesim, like Reb Shimon. So exactly what is Shmuel coming to Mechadish? He's coming to Mechadish that in the same case of avudim in Pesach, is he karv shlomim? So the Gemara asks, mashmalon, I don't need Shmuel for that. We have that in the Mishnah itself. Back on Daf Tzadi Vav and Beis, we learned that if a Pesach was lost, and they were mafresh the second one to replace the first one, then he found the first one after they shechted the second one, Yikarev Shlomim. And the Gemara explained already back on Daf Tzadi Vav that what the Mishnah has in mind is that after the Shechita, or shall we say, according to Rabbi Zera, after the Zman Shechita, that's when they found the Karban Rishon, the first one. And it seems clear, therefore, that a Pesach Sha'avud, that it was lost at the time of Chatzos, then Yikar Shlomim. In other words, Avudim the Pesach Yikar. So why do I need Shmuel to repeat that which we learned explicitly from the Mishnah? So the Gemara answers that Shmuel is Lafuki min Rabbi Yochanan. The Chiddush of Shmuel is to argue against Rabbi Yochanan, reject Rabbi Yochanan Yomar, because Rabbi Yochanan, we saw in Daf Tzadi Zayin Amud Aleph, said that Einam Pesach Karv Shlomim Ela Sha'avav V'Nimtza Achar Hashchita. If they located the first carbon after they checked the second carbon, then there's halacha of Pesach Karv Shlomim. Aval Kodem Shchita. If they found the first carbon before they checked the sheni, low. Why? Because then we can apply the principle of Dechia. even though it was lost at the time of Chatzos. Nevertheless, halach is Yeroeh. Alma, we see from Rabbi Yochanan that Shchita Kava Dichui, that when he shechts the second carbon, the replacement carbon, that's Koveh. The first one has Dachui. And that's why the din is Yeroeh, and it cannot be brought as a carbon at all, even as a shlamim, kamashmal, and that's why Shmuel wants to tell us, no. There's a halacha of chatzos kava, that chatzos is going to be kovea the rishon to be nidche. And when Shmuel says kol shebechatos mesa, that reflects the shita Reb Shimon, that any case of a chatas avuda, and it was lost at the time of the afresh of the second replacement chatos, it's mesa. And now Shmuel wants to teach us a chiddush that in this case, in a parallel case in Korban Pesach, it's Karev Shlamim, because every Pesach is considered avud, as long as it was avud at Chatzos, and therefore it's Karev Shlamim. Even though we found it before we shechted the second one, and you would have applied the principle of Dechia. And the answer is because the Zman of Chatzos is Kovea Dechia. And the shchita of the second carbon is not Kovea Dechia as far as the first carbon Pesach. Now, the Gemara is about to offer a second interpretation, a different tradition of Shmuel. Because until now, when Shmuel made the statement that Kol shebechatas mesa b'Pesach Karev Shlamim and b'chatas roa af b'Pesach roa, and the Gemara asked the kasha, and as a result of the kasha, the Gemara identified Shmuel as limited to the case of avud, and only with regard to a chatas and Pesach sha'avdu, and then the Bailim replaced it with a second carbon, and then they found the first one. And that's what Shmuel was referring to. But then, again, the Gemara had asked the kasha on that chatas avuda is roa according to the Chachamim, whereas Pesach avud is karev shlamim. So you can't say that anything that's avuda and chatas is roa and chatas is roa and shlamim in Pesach. Excuse me. So the Gemara answered that Shmuel held like Rebbe, that chatas avuda mesa. And on that he held that in a parallel case of a chatas avuda, in a Pesach avuda, the din would be karev shlamim. So that's what we had until now in the first Lishna. And now the Gemara is going to present a different answer to the original question that brought us to the conclusion of identifying Shmuel with Rebbe. Lishna achrina. Now, the Gemara is going to now ask the same kasha on Shmuel that we asked before. How could we say that any chatas that's roa is also Pesach roa? After all, chatas avuda, and he was mafresh the second one to replace the first one. Now we found the first one before he shechted the second one. It's according to the sheet of the Chachamim. Its din is l're'iyah v'lo l'misa, and in Pesach, heichad yovad achar chatzos kodem hashchita is he karev shlamim. And this is all again a reflection of Rabbi Zera's shita, that everything depends upon chatzos. Chatzos is kovea. So even though it was avud at the time that he had designated the second carbon to replace the first, so we asked, how could Shmuel say that whenever it's roa and chatos, it's in Pesach, it's also roa? Because here we're talking about a case where, according to Chachamim, the din of a chatos she'avda is roa, and yet in Pesach it's ikarev shlamim. So Gemara answers Shmuel kirabba svirale. We've been assuming until now that Shmuel holds like Rabbi Zera, that the critical moment to determine the nature of the Pesach is the moment of chatzos, when it's tchilas hakrava. But now we're going to introduce Rabbah. The Amar Rabbah was of the opinion that shchita kava, that it's the moment of the shchita of the second replacement karva, that's going to determine whether the first one is dachui or not the shas chatzos. And therefore, according to the sheet of Rabbah, Bechol Pam Avud Nimtza, Bekayim Lefanenu B'Shas Shchitas Hasheni Nidcha Me'akrova V'Yirot. Forget about Shas Chatzos. The Dichui Halacha depends upon the Zman of Shchita. And when the Shchita, the replacement, takes place, we would doche the Karban Pesach Rishon, and therefore Yirot. And that's what Shmuel meant when he said, Kol Shebechatas Roa Gam Pesach Roa, that both in Pesach and in Chatas it's Roa. If the animal was lost at the time of the designation of the replacement Karban, and we found the Karban that was lost before the Kapar, before the Shchita of the second Karban, then in both cases, the Avuda, the first Karban, is Roa. And now it works out beautifully according to Rabbah, if Shmuel holds like Rabbah. So the Gemara says, no, wait a second. Let's take a look at the case in which Shmuel rejected Rabbi Yochanan. V'amida kam Rabbi Yochanan Allah. When Rabbi Yochanan heard Shmuel's klal, he immediately dissented. And Eina Pesach Karev Shlamim, a Pesach that was lost cannot be brought Shlamim, Ella, unless it was Nimtza Liachar Shchita. We only located the first Karban after we shechted the second Karban. Vol Kodem Shchita, if we found the first Karban before Shchita, lo, we're going to apply the principle of Roeh, and we're going to insist that there's a Dechia. Alma, we see that according to Rabbi Yochanan, Shchita Kava, that if you want to know whether there's Dichui or not, it all depends upon the moment of Shchita. And if you found the Karban before the Shchita, the second Karban, then there's a din of Dechia, and it's Roeh. Now, for the fact that Rabbi Yochanan attacked Shmuel, by implication, we could derive a conclusion about Shmuel himself. Michlal, the Shmuel Savar, Chatzos Kava. Shmuel holds like Rabbi Zera, not like Rabbah. He holds that Chatzos is Kovea, whether or not there's a din Dechia. Not Shchita, but Chatzos. Because since the language of Rabbi Yochanan of Avud, Karev Shlamim, only if you found it after you shechted the second Karban. But if you found it before you shechted the second Karban, then it's not going to be, just 1 second, let me just get that straight. That according to Rabbi Yochanan, if it was found, if it was relocated when? Before the Shechita, then we cannot apply the principle of what? Of Karev Shlamim, but rather we're going to apply the principle of Roeh. And from the fact that Shmuel, that Rabbi Yochanan was rejecting Shmuel, it must be that Shmuel argued and he held that Chatzos is Kovea. So now again, after we've proven conclusively that Shmuel does not hold like Rabbah, so we're back to our original kasha. How could Shmuel say that if the Chatzos is Roeh, in Pesach is Roeh? Because in the case of Chatzos Havuda, if it was lost at the time of Afrosh and then we found it before the Hakrava, before the Shechita and the Kapara, Roeh. And in Pesach, in that case, it's Karev Shlamim. Ela Shmuel Kerebi Svirale. We're going back now to the original position that we identified Shmuel with Rebbe. The Amar and Shmuel holds like Rebbe, who maintains that Avuda Lemisa Ozla. He disagrees with the Chacham. The Chacham say that Avuda is not Mesa, unless it was found after the Kapar Sabailim with a second replacement Karban. And therefore, Chatas and Pesach Avudim are included in the first klal of Shmuel, which is Kol Shebechatas Mesa, the Pesach Karev Shlamim. So we're back to what we said before, that Shmuel should be identified with Rebbe. So the Gemara asks, V'kol Shebechatos Avudim L'shitas Rebbe Mesim. And if you remember, we never found a case, according to Rebbe, of Chatos Roeh. Pesach Hecha Diavid Kodem Chatzos, V'nimtza Rishon Kodem Chatzos, is Roeh. So how do we work ourselves out of this mess that we mentioned earlier, that the second klal of Shmuel doesn't seem to have any application? The Gemara answers, because Sover Shmuel, that Avud Konum Chatzos, Lav Avudu. It's not considered Avud if it got lost before Chatzos, before this man of Roy La Krova. And therefore Shmuel never mentioned and never related to such a case. He was only talking about something that was Avud when it was Roy La Krova. So from this teretz and onwards, we see that the Lashon, the second Lishna of Shmuel, that Imshicha Lodim B'divrei Shmuel as Kushos HaTeirutzim Sheneskarim Lashon Rishon. We saw that the Gemara, after quoting the second Lishna, continues with the same sets of questions and answers that we had for the first Lishna, until it finally concludes that Shmuel holds like Rabbi Shimon, which means that Chata Shekiper Balel Yolam Mesa, and Kol Divrei Shmuel now, Hayurak Bechatas Mesa Bepesach Karv Shlomim. And he never made the statement of Kol Shebechatas Roa Af Bepesach Roa, because Savar and Shmuel holds that Zman Chatzos is Kovea, the behemoth for the Chia, and the Chiddush is that if you found the Pesach after Chatzos, Yi Karv Shlomim, and it's not like Rabbi Yochanan who said Yi Roa. Why? Because Chatzos is Kovea. And this leads us to the Mishnah on the bottom of Daf Tzadi Zayin Amud Beis. Now, a Korban Pesach has to be from a Zachar, from a male, ben Shana, up until a year old, because the pasuk says, "Set Tamim Zachar ben Shana Yelachem and Akvasim and Izim Tikhu Tikachu." Now the Mishnah is going to address the case of somebody who was mafresh a behema for a Korban Pesach, and it wasn't royal Pesach. A mafresh, he was mafresh either a kizba or an aiz nekeva lepischo. Oh, Zachar ben Shtei Shanim, past its first year. So in both these cases, Einam Ruyim leKorban Pesach. Is he royad she'istavi mocher v'yiplu dovav l'nidava l'shlom. He was mafresh a korban that's not roy for Pesach, so we apply the principle of Yeroya, and after it becomes Balmum, it's possible Mizbeach, we'll sell it as chulin, and the domim that we buy, that we receive in payment, will be earmarked for a nidava for shlomim. Now, the reason why in this case it's not korev shlomim is because the hafrasha l'shem Pesach was kovea a korban Pesach, but it's not royal lakach, and therefore it's considered nidche milahakriv. Even though again it was nidche, it was mitchilasa was dochi, it was a female or it was a bat shnatayim, but nevertheless it's considered like a korban that was nikba bin nidche, and therefore cannot be brought as a korban shlomim. However, the Mishnah continues, hamafresh pischo v'mes, if he was mafresh a korban Pesach, and then he died, lo yevi enu b'no achrov l'shem Pesach, el l'shem shlomim. Why? Because the ben was not monu on this Pesach, and a korban Pesach is only shechted l'nuyav, and once he died, he's not considered money on the Pesach, and therefore they cannot bring the korban as a korban Pesach, but rather l'shem shlomim. The ben could bring his father's korban as a korban shlomim. Okay, then, so this is where we're going to stop.